Trump!
One of the top leaders of the Maricopa County GOP, Shelby Bush, representing our state on the national stage at the Republican National Convention, just weeks after making this comment.
When Stephen Richard walked in this room, I would lynch him.
Maricopa County recorder Stephen Richard responding tonight on her appearance at the convention, casting Arizona's votes.
I think it is problematic that a serious political responsibility at a serious political event should be handed over to somebody who is not a responsible actor.
This comes on the heels of the attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump, with people on both sides of the aisle calling for unity.
The state of the country is sad. What happened over the weekend is unacceptable.
Richard knows firsthand the dangers of extreme political rhetoric. Since the 2022 election, several men have been sentenced or indicted for threatening the county's top election official.
As people in positions of authority or people where people listen to you, you need to be careful with your words, because a lot of this incendiary language creates a permission structure for people who might not be 100% healthy to take it into their heads that it's okay to threaten somebody.
And last month, Bush had told Arizona's family her comment was a joke and made in jest, adding she does not condone violence. Obviously, still a very sensitive topic, especially after what happened to the former president over the weekend.
A lot of people talking about how this rhetoric and political hyperbole is just dangerous and unwelcome at a time like this. Emma, thanks.